Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this virtual professional development opportunity. My name is Joe Schmidt, and I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education. Our session this afternoon is talking about the Electoral College and Maine's role in that. Our presenter today is Neil Young from MSAD 49. He is a proud social studies teacher at Lawrence High School, and he was a frequent participant of all of the virtual PD that we've had, so much so that when I was looking for teacher leaders for the 2020-2021 school year to do virtual professional development, Neil was one of the teachers I reached out to. He wanted to talk about the Electoral College and Maine's role in that, and I said, great, can we set you up right before the election? He said, absolutely. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Neil Young to tell us about the Electoral College and Maine's role in it.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Joe. I know that a lot of teachers out there kind of found what MDOE offered as a refuge, and I really think we have one of the best departments of education in the country. So thanks for having me to talk about this important and sometimes complex system that we have here in the United States. The election is just a week away, so it's a good time for us to get our bearings on what the Electoral College is, as well as kind of how it's developed over time. So after we get through the basics, we're going to look at how the Electoral College has changed over the course of various elections. So the first thing I want us to think about is just that, what is the Electoral College? Now, the Electoral College is how we elect president. There are 538 electors who cast their votes in December to actually decide who becomes president. With that in mind, you need 270 electors to win. These electors, based on each state system, are pledged to a certain candidate, but they can change their mind. They can break these pledges, and we'll come back to that later. So what ends up happening on election day is each state has a system for deciding which candidate their electors are going to be pledged to. We'll see how in early American history, this typically happened with state legislatures. So in our case at the time, the legislature of Massachusetts, us just being a province, would have decided who was going to get the points, essentially, that state was worth. More recently, every state ends up doing some sort of popular vote system, Maine doing a congressional district method, but all allowing voters to participate in that process. One of the questions that comes up is, where do we get that number for electors, right? Why does Maine have 4 and California has 55? And that's because the Constitution tells us that the number of electors a state has is going to be equal to the representation in Congress. So Maine has 2 senators, 2 members in the House of Representatives, so it gets 4. California with 55, that tells us that they have 2 senators and that they have 53 members in the House of Representatives. The lowest number that a state can have is 3, and that's simply because as a bare minimum, every state needs 2 senators and 1 elector. Sometimes people point out that the representation in Wyoming is greater per person, right? So you have a small population with 3 electors, and if Wyoming's population was 50,000 people, right, we would still be looking at 3 electors. So it gives small states kind of an extra cushion, allows them to punch above their weight in some ways when it comes to the Electoral College. And the question of how states go about and pledge their electors, like I said, is the legislatures started it, but then it moved to a popular vote, and it can really be anything that the state decides, right? In the first couple of elections, as we're going to see, it was all over the place, right? You end up having some like Tennessee, where there would be elections for electors at the town level. And then those kind of elector stand-ins would vote for who was going to be at the county level. And then the counties would get together and figure out who was going to be at the state level. You have others like Massachusetts, where each congressional district was worth different numbers of points, and the legislature would step in if there wasn't any single elector that won a majority. So it can change over time. What a faithless elector is however the state decides to figure out to pledge their electors to a candidate, right? So election day happens in November, and then a month later, there are electors who get together and actually then cast those electoral votes. They're being cast by a human being at that time. If an elector breaks that pledge, okay, they're known as a faithless elector. So let's say, for instance, a good example is in 2016, right? 3 of Maine's electors went to Hillary Clinton and 1 was pledged to Donald Trump. But one of those electors actually, who was pledged to Hillary, decided to cast his ballot for Bernie Sanders, right? So then he became a faithless elector, right? A good question that comes up is, how can states stop faithless electors, right? So when we look at each state, again, it varies because states have a lot of control over how they run their elections. In Maine, when an elector it becomes faithless, okay, they cast their electoral vote for someone that the people did not choose, it's automatically invalidated, right? So the second it's handed in, it essentially disappears, and the elector can then either cast a ballot for the right person or someone else comes in and casts it for them. That happens in about 14 states. Many states have penalties against it, saying you're not allowed to, but most don't enforce it with any sort of law. If a state does have a penalty for becoming a faithless elector, then it isn't any more than $1,000 fine, right? So relatively small. And again, some states have none. The Supreme Court recently ruled that you can basically force electors that are pledged to vote a certain way to do so, and there can be penalties, but that doesn't mean they won't do it. In a lot of states, it would just mean that if they did, they would have to come up with $1,000, right? Even with this said, faithless electors have never changed the outcome of an election, but it doesn't mean that they couldn't at some point in the future. The last basic part to get in before we look at the elections themselves is what happens if someone does not win a majority in the electoral college, right? So they don't receive, in our case, 270 electors. If that occurs, the election then goes to the House of Representatives, where each state's delegation kind of huddles together and gets 1 vote. So California, with its 53 representatives, would all gather together and they would go back and forth and they would see, okay, which of these top candidates for president are we going to give our support to? If a state, let's say Maine, was gridlocked, okay, let's say Shelley Pingree wanted to go one way and Jared Golden wanted to go the other, right, and they're gridlocked in this way, then the state essentially abstains from voting, right? It isn't able to cast one. So you can also see it this way, but every state would then just have 1 vote in that system. So even though, for instance, California would have 53, their vote would be worth just as much as Maine's is, right? Almost kind of like a mini Senate in that way. So now to those elections. The first elections we have, elections of 1789 and 1792, end up going really smoothly, right? It is a unanimous victory for George Washington as president, and then his vice president becomes John Adams. So at this early point in American history, before we get the 12th Amendment, whoever got the most votes, right, in the Electoral College became the president. Whoever got the second most votes became the vice president. We're going to see kind of shortly how that ends up being quite an issue as we go on. But in the beginning, only about 2% of the country was allowed to vote. But we still had a few states that did use the popular vote. For instance, Massachusetts had kind of like a quasi congressional district method system. So it's somewhat like what we have today, but not exactly. And you did have people who voted. In most places that was reserved for white males who are 21 years of age or older and had property. But we'll see how even this starts to change shortly thereafter. In 1796 and 1800, in In these two elections, you kind of see the party led by Jefferson, okay, the Jeffersonians or Democratic Republicans as they're known, go head to head with John Adams, former vice president, who was a Federalist. Now, in the first election, you end up having a lot of people who support both candidates. And as a result, John Adams finishes first and Thomas Jefferson finishes second, right? So we mentioned how top finisher is president, second finisher is vice president. So you have this weird setup because our founders were not anticipating there to be parties. They didn't think of having political parties, right? But you have this awkward situation where the leaders of the two parties are now kind of in an administration together. In the election of 1800, right, something worse happens. So in this election of 1800, as we'll notice up here in electoral votes, Thomas Jefferson and his running mate Aaron Burr actually tied. So people had gotten wise to how the system was going to go, and they put forward a ticket. Each elector had 2 votes they could cast, right? They could cast 1 for president and 1 for vice president, right? And just whoever got the most was going to win. So in this case, Aaron Burr was supposed to lose the Electoral College by just 1 vote, right? He was supposed to get 72. But the elector who was supposed to throw away their vote basically forgot to do so. You end up having it tied 73-73. So since no one won a majority of the electors, right, as we talked about, it got kicked over to the House of Representatives. In the House of Representatives, we see yet another tie with some states kind of gridlocked and unable to produce a vote. And that ballot is stuck. The reasonable thing to do, right, would be Aaron Burr steps aside. He supports Jefferson for president because that was the whole plan. But Burr being Burr, he did not. And there ended up being 35 more rounds of voting with the exact same result. Okay. Eventually, Alexander Hamilton steps in and he puts his support behind Jefferson, and Jefferson is able to come out on top. But because Burr ended up second, he became the vice president, right? So you had a very awkward administration there. And after this election, it became clear we needed to change the system. We end up passing the 12th Amendment, which clarifies that one person running for president and can get presidential votes that way. The other one is going to be vice president. And we still see some people would cast, a ballot for, let's say, Jefferson, one for Burr, but they could also have picked, Charles Pinckney or whatever they wanted to. So you didn't need to necessarily cast those electors in the way that the candidates intended you to do. A little bit after the election, 1804, Burr actually kills Hamilton in a duel. So I don't know if that was strictly just payback for his meddling in the election of 1800, but it might have been. The next couple sets that we hear.
Can I interrupt you really quick? There's a question here from how is the number of representatives a state will have decided?
Oh, absolutely. So the way we decide how many representatives a state will have is everyone starts off with 1, and then it's based off of population. So the larger a state is, the more representatives it will have. And one thing we'll dig into a little bit later is why did we stop at 435? So what had happened in the beginning is we noticed like the Electoral College is growing because the number of representatives is growing and senators is growing every couple of years. So what had happened is every 10 years when we had the census, right, Congress would get together and they'd say, okay, how much should we increase? How many more representatives is the country going to need? And then you divvy it up between the states. But when we get to 1929, they basically decide that's it. 435 is the max. We are not going any further. So after growing from a low of 69 up to 435, we've then been stuck there since 1929. That answer the question?
I would say yes.
But really good question. Keep throwing those in to make sure we get all the information covered. So the elections of 1816 and 1820, they aren't overly remarkable, right? We see that James Monroe wins in a big fashion. But it went smoothly in part because at this point we have the 12th Amendment. We started figuring out how different systems are going to use. And we start seeing more and more states picking up a type of winner take all system is what Pennsylvania used and still uses today. Other ones, such as Massachusetts, ends up using the exact same congressional district method that we now use. Okay, they do that in 1820. And Maine, as it becomes its own state, keeps that system through 1828. So it's about this time in history where people are starting to finally figure out, okay, what are some effective ways of choosing our electors during the presidential election, with more states deciding that the people should play a indirect role, but still be involved. And it really starts solidifying around those two systems, the winner take all system and the congressional district method. Although we're still going to have state legislatures playing a role in states like South Carolina until after the Civil War. One interesting part about this election, though, is in 1816, you're going to notice Rufus King, right? So Rufus King is of Scarborough, Maine. He ends up going to the Continental Congress. He helps write the Northwest Ordinance, including the language that kind of bars slavery from extending into that territory. The Constitutional Convention, he famously kind of calls out everyone when they start discussing the 3/5 compromise, saying it's ridiculous that either you should free these people or they don't get the count towards your representation in Congress. But sadly, Rufus King only ended up with 34 of the electors in this one. And in 1820, the Federalists didn't even bother putting up a legitimate candidate. It was, pretty dominant, shown by Democratic Republicans in that. Once we get to 24 and 28, the elections start becoming interesting again. So in 1824, you ended up having John Quincy Adams, so the eldest son of John and Abigail Adams, go against Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson's in this. His nickname is Old Hickory. And actually, the fact that we're getting more nicknames is kind of a consequence of the fact that more states are opening it up to the voters getting to play an active role in this, right? Because you start campaigning, and as a result of those campaignings, some of the nicknames and then also slogans start becoming more popular, even though candidates themselves aren't going to be directly campaigning for quite some time. So in this, there's now 260 electors up for grabs, and 24 states are involved. It's a hotly contested race between 4 candidates. And at the end of the day, you end up seeing that going in, Jackson ends up with a sizable lead. Okay, he ends up having 41% of the popular vote, but he falls far short of the 131 electors he was going to need to win. Right, as we talked about, the popular vote, right, is arguably now a legitimate way to start viewing elections. Right. Say arguably, because between 1824 and 1828, you start seeing states not just turn to use the popular vote in their elections, but also start removing some of the restrictions, some of the requirements. So by 1828, when these people face off again, you're going to notice that many of the states have kind of removed their land requirements. So it's almost universal suffrage for white men who are 21 years of age or older, which doesn't sound like anything great, but at this point in history, that was still a pretty dramatic move towards democracy. So because he did not win the Electoral College, as we talked about, it gets tossed to the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, John Quincy Adams, despite only having 31% of the vote, right, far below Jackson and even far behind in the Electoral College, the House decides to make John Quincy Adams president. The Speaker of the House at that time was actually Henry Clay, who finished 4th. And because he later becomes Adams' Secretary of State, this is sometimes called the corrupt bargain, right? It made Jackson's supporters very frustrated at the result. But it is worth us stopping the pause, because this is typically seen as one where the person who, quote unquote, won the popular vote was kind of robbed of the election. But we're seeing how the popular vote's only growing really slowly over time. And when we say popular vote, he would still have been one of the presidents with the lowest percentage of the popular vote in history, right? 41%. So if we think of it that way, then 59% of people voted for someone else. And how popular is a popular vote when we're still at best only talking about white men 21 years of age or older, right? So still questioning if this is a good way to figure out elections given how few people are able to participate. In 1828, it's a rematch. And now there are only 2 holdouts when it comes to using the popular vote. Okay, South Carolina and Delaware still use their legislatures to decide who their electors are going to be pledged to. But the rest of the states are using various forms of popular vote. And when I say various forms of popular vote, it's because it could mean congressional district method. It could mean that they're using a winner-take-all system. So whoever wins the most votes in a state wins all. You still have some weird ones like New Hampshire that have a system where voters can put their support behind a certain candidate. And if in a certain district, one candidate doesn't receive over 50% of the vote, then the legislature steps in and decides for them. But again, we seem to be kind of consolidating around these 2 different methods of pledging electors. So in this one, Jackson wins with a clear majority and kind of welcomes in a much more substantial popular vote, right? If we see the differences, 647 and 508, right, to previously 153,000 and 108,000, right? So just a very large expansion in the number of votes people are having. By the time we get to 1860, right, we see how the popular vote totals have increased somewhat dramatically by this time, right? The population is growing. And as we talked about, every few years, Congress is getting together and expanding the number of people in the House of Representatives, which ends up expanding or increasing the number of electoral votes there are in the Electoral College. One of the things that we see in this election, though, is that even though Lincoln wins and he receives more votes than anyone else, popular vote, if we go with the one being pushed by a lot of states, right, of just going for whoever wins the popular vote wins the election, right? It's true that Lincoln would have won this election, but he would have done so with about 40% of the vote. So even then, we're talking about popular vote, but most presidents who win the popular vote do so as a plurality. So they get more votes than everyone else, but it's fairly uncommon for someone, at least during their first term, to get a majority of all votes cast. But he does win a clear victory in the Electoral College and become president. This is another good time to talk about that. Even if we talk about popular votes, we should also consider who is voting, right? About 12% of the United States population was still enslaved at this point in time. And if they had been able to play an active role, who knows if that 40% could have edged quite a bit closer to 50% of the vote overall. Because in each state, we also see that states decide who gets to vote, right? To this day, the laws for who gets to vote in Maine are much different than those in Florida, and Texas is different than Illinois, right? So who's allowed to vote and how they can vote is still varies quite a bit from state to state. Right. Now in the election of 1872, the period we know as Reconstruction starts right after the Civil War. And the Confederacy, after it was defeated, it was also then occupied by Union soldiers, many of whom were African American. And as the former Confederacy is reintegrated into the country, there are what's known as the Reconstruction Amendments that they have to agree to. And these are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So the 13th Amendment ends slavery. The 14th Amendment basically extends citizenship to everyone born on US soil or to American parents, right? Essentially a way to ensure that newly freed African Americans were going to be given the full rights of citizenship. And the 15th Amendment says that these states can no longer deny people the right to vote based on their race. Amendments such as the 15th and the 19th about women's suffrage are typically put in the view of giving the right to vote to people. And that isn't the case. From the very beginning of our country, people, no matter their race, no matter their sex, could have been voting in all the states because it's a state issue. It's just that most states denied people that right. So the 15th Amendment says states still decide elections, but you can no longer deny people the right to vote based on race. And we still had a large number of Union soldiers in those areas to kind of ensure the protection of African Americans and to ensure that these governments were integrated back into the Union. But even at this time, you had groups like the KKK and the White League who were carrying out massacres and executions of politicians. The White League even overthrows the government of Louisiana for a few days. So despite this, there ends up being 300 Black candidates are elected to state and federal offices throughout the South. And a little bit later, we're going to see that even a majority of South Carolina's legislature ends up being of African descent. So this is a pretty interesting time, and the vote has expanded a lot. Now it's expanded to everyone you can't deny it based on race. So in the election, we have the incumbent Ulysses S. Grant, famous general in the Civil War, go against kind of newspaper magnate Horace Greeley. So Horace Greeley actually, unfortunately, passes away during this election. He passes away a few days after the election, but he had 66 electors pledged to him. So when the Electoral College met in December, one of the big questions was, what are these electors supposed to do? And in this election, 63 of them became faithless electors. They ended up dividing their votes up between Brown, who was the vice president on Greeley's ticket, to Thomas Hendricks, right? And these electors were all able to break out. If the electors had had no power to change who they were pledged to, then they would have had 66 electors cast for someone who is sadly no longer with us. And some have pointed this as kind of a strength of the Electoral College, especially at this time when it was hard to get information all throughout the country. Grant ends up winning by a pretty large margin, K286. But an interesting thing to keep in mind, if we look down at Arkansas and Louisiana, right, two sets of ballots end up getting sent in. Essentially, Republicans sent in one, Democrats the other. And the results in Louisiana and Arkansas are invalidated, right? They're not sure. There's voter fraud going in, intimidation, and they're uncertain of which electors should basically show up and cast those votes. Should it be the electors backing Greeley or the electors backing Grant? And because they can't figure it out, they just don't cast any electors. They don't get to cast any electoral votes that time around. But like we said, Grant won a clear majority. He won more than 50% in the Electoral College, so this isn't an issue, but we're going to see that becomes an issue very quickly. So we go over here. So just 4 years later, some of the problems we see come up in 1872 are going to become even much bigger issues. So the race is between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. And during this election, there actually ends up being 4 states who have their results invalidated or at least brought into question. And those states are Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and then Oregon. Oregon just makes a mistake. You can't have an elector be an elected official, and they made that mistake. I think like one of their senators was named an elector, and like, you're not allowed to do that. So we're not accepting this electoral college votes. In the other states, the problem was that it was unclear who received the most votes in those states, right? And in this election, there was a lot of voter intimidation and accusations of kind of ballot box stuffing. So at the end, Samuel Tilden had a lead in the popular vote, but again, it was kind of unclear how many people didn't vote based on the actions of different members in society, right? Or how many fraudulent votes were cast for Samuel Tilden. And when it gets sent to the House, this is looked at really closely, but it simply says that Congress will count the results. Okay, so we'll see whatever the state decided, what electors they're sending to us, and then they'll cast their votes in the Electoral College. But since there were two returns from these states, it was unclear which one they should open, right? Should they go with one that was sent by the governor of that state or by the state legislature? And as they couldn't decide what to do and the Constitution was unclear, they established a commission that came together and did really diligent work to find a solution. But we're now into March, and it's a day before the inauguration. Both candidates are planning to take the oath of office and setting up all the celebrations. And then a deal is struck. And what the deal is that Tilden, even though he had been ahead in the Electoral College, even though he theoretically at least won the popular vote, he would concede to Rutherford B. Hayes. They would basically accept the results that favored Hayes, and Hayes in return would remove all of the troops from the former Confederacy, essentially bringing Reconstruction to an end. What those troops have been doing is carrying out and enforcing the 15th Amendment, and Congress would not make a strong attempt to do so again for nearly 100 years. These next couple elections we'll move through quickly because they don't tell us a lot about the Electoral College, but they do involve a lot of Mainers. So just a quick aside on them. So in the election of 1884, you see James G. Blaine of Maine go up against Grover Cleveland. So James G. Blaine had served in both chambers of Congress, had been the Speaker of House for 6 years, and he managed to pick himself up quite a lot of enemies. So during the campaign, a common chant that was used is Blaine, Blaine, James G. Blaine, the continental liar from the state of Maine, right? So there's a lot of mudslinging in this election. And if we just look at the results, we would think that Cleveland won handily, right? 219 to 182, right? Until we notice how many electors New York is worth, right? So New York is worth 36. The election overall was decided by 0.5% in the popular vote. But more importantly, it was decided by 0.1% in New York. So in an election in which 10 million ballots are cast, we're really talking about the size of the population of Dixmont outside of Bangor being what kept James G. Blaine from winning the presidential election. In the next round of them, in 1888, in this election, right, we see another example where super close election, but in this case, right, Benjamin Harrison actually loses to Grover Cleveland in the popular vote. But as we talked about, what decides the elections are the electors one receives, not how many popular votes they do. At this point in time, Maine did its presidential elections, gubernatorial elections in September. So every September, Maine would vote to see who became governor, and later on would then participate in the presidential elections come November, right? But for big stretches of time, whoever Maine elected as governor, whatever party they're a part of, ended up winning the presidential election more times than not. So Maine, especially after this election, is starting to be used as a bellwether. It's where we end up getting the saying, as goes Maine, so goes the nation. Because Maine elects a Republican governor, and a little bit later, Benjamin Harrison wins the presidential election despite losing the popular vote. Because again, that's not what matters. How they do in the Electoral College is. So sorry, trying to work my way around the Zoom. There we go. All right. Maine actually ends up getting it wrong in the next election, and Grover Cleveland becomes our only president to serve non-consecutive terms. But it wouldn't be wrong again until 1912. But 1912 was a tricky one to try and call. So at this point in time, the number of electors has grown considerably, and we have really three legitimate candidates. So Theodore Roosevelt had been president, taking over from McKinley when he was assassinated and then winning a term in his own right. And then he had promised to step away and never run again, right? His protege, William Howard Taft, then steps in, becomes president, and Theodore Roosevelt decides he wants to get back into power. So at the Republican convention, he ends up challenging Taft and losing. And when he leaves, he takes a whole bunch of Republican voters with him and creates the Bull Moose Party, right? So now we're going to have a race where two candidates who had very similar policy goals in their careers, right? And had formerly had a really close relationship, both wanted the Republican nomination, are now both fairly popular and running in a three-way race with Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson ends up winning this election with 435 electoral votes, right? Because he wins more votes than anyone else in these states. But when it comes to popular vote, he ends up with 6.3 million votes. The reason this is interesting is because that's only 42%. And if you were to combine Taft and Roosevelt's votes together using a ranked choice voting system, it's impossible to tell, but it's likely that they could have come out on top. Essentially in the election, 58% of Americans wanted someone other than Woodrow Wilson, but he was able to win convincingly in the Electoral College. Eugene V. Debs also had a pretty sizable showing himself. Right. When it comes to 1932, 1936, we see a massive expansion in the number of votes cast, and this is because the electorate had essentially doubled. The 19th Amendment is passed in 1920, ensuring that states could no longer deny women the right to vote. And this ends up being a pretty lopsided victory for Roosevelt, as Herbert Hoover is president, as the Great Depression is kind of worsening, and people figure that it is time for a change. It's also in this election and next election where Maine, yet again, right? It's no longer hitting its bellwether status. It's predicting Republican when Democrat is going to carry the day. And in the very next election, it kind of loses. Sorry about that. There we go. Kind of loses bellwether status. It becomes one of only two states to vote for Republican Alf Landon, which FDR's campaign manager quipped, as Maine goes, so goes Vermont, right? So it's kind of lost that status in the eyes of a lot of people. And a little bit later, we actually get rid of the September gubernatorial elections. Sweet. In 1964, we have Lyndon Baines Johnson, who had been John F. Kennedy's vice president, take on Barry Goldwater. In this election, we see an expansion of the Electoral College and of the number of people who can vote. We finally have now hit 538 electors after all this time, and that is because Washington, D.C. is added with the 23rd Amendment as saying it has as many electors as the least populous state, right? In this case, that means it's going to have 3 electors. But we're now finally at 538. And to get to that point, we've had 435 since 1929, right? And all those extras are just states. Because as states get added, the Senate gets bigger. And that was really the real source of growth in the Electoral College. LBJ ends up winning with a pretty large margin, and 36% of the total population voted. And this was about 61% of voting age population. So certainly by the time we get into the 1960s, we can legitimately talk about a popular vote that is representative of the feelings and beliefs and will of kind of all adults inside the United States. And for the last couple year, we have 1972, right? And, oh, there's 68. Oh yeah, sorry, 1968. So in 1968, we see a pretty close election between Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon and George Wallace, whose American Independent Party was essentially running on a segregationist policy. And, predictably, he did very well in the Deep South. So this is a pretty close election. Hubert Humphrey's vice presidential candidate, it was Ed Muskie, who would later in 72 fail to capture his party's nomination after what we'd probably describe as fake news nowadays, right? Where he had a letter that made it seem as though he's prejudiced against French Canadians. And we end up with a fairly close election. And George Wallace down here was still like 9.9 million votes, right? But because this election was so close, a lot of people throughout the country started saying that maybe a popular vote really is the way to go. Maybe we should get rid of the Electoral College and just let the people decide. And we actually see amendments pass the House of Representatives that would have given us a direct popular vote. And it goes to the Senate, and then it ends up being blocked by segregationists like Strom Thurmond, who felt as though if you got rid of the Electoral College, it meant kind of the power of Black voters throughout the Deep South would be felt in the nation. Because currently, right, as we saw, you have Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, right? As long as a block of white voters reached over 50%, they could do 50, and that they could do 80, they could do 90, they could do 100, whatever it was still going to kind of cancel out any votes from African Americans in these states. So after a pretty long filibuster, the bill never comes to a vote. It doesn't come for several more years. And sometimes people point to this as kind of evidence that the Electoral College is kind of remnant, an artifice or an artifact of kind of a racist origin. So we have 72, and then we're just going to take a quick look at the modern presidential elections in short order. So in this one, okay, we have a massive landslide by Richard Nixon. It ends up being the 4th largest Electoral College victory by anyone not named George Washington. He defeats George McGovern with over 60% of the vote, and the number of voters has expanded yet again. So we're getting more voters, but the number of electors in the Electoral College is staying the same. And this is because the 26th Amendment then keeps states from denying people the right to vote who are 18 years of age or older. Maine's shortly before them was turned to 20, but pretty much nationwide and in most other countries, the age had been 21. But the argument ended up being old enough to fight, old enough to vote. So since World War II, you had veterans coming back from these wars who had fought for their country, but weren't allowed to help decide policy through voting. So this was one of the last major expansions of the number of people who could vote. With a few years before, in 1968, a radical expansion by the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act of 64 and 65, which was Congress's real first attempt to really enforce the 15th and 14th Amendment since the end of Reconstruction. So Now we get to like nowadays. So we've seen how all these different things can play out through history, but also how they've played out in more recent elections. We had a handful of elections where the person who didn't win the popular vote still went on to win the election as a whole. But that's happened 2 times since 2000. And in the last 7 presidential elections, the only person who won a majority of the popular vote as part of their first term as president was Barack Obama. It didn't happen for Clinton, it didn't happen for Bush, and it did not happen for Trump. In the year 2000, we saw a contested election kind of at the same level of 1876 as far as people didn't know what the results were. It came down to, instead of 1,100 votes, only around 537 votes in an election in which, over 100 million votes are being cast. And that's really the population of Islesboro is deciding the election. Sorry? Oh. And in 2008, right, Barack Obama is able to defeat John McCain, and has an even bigger, and has still a significant victory when it comes to votes against Mitt Romney. But Tegan Goddard of the Political Wire says that if in this election we had used Maine's congressional district method throughout the country, that despite losing the popular vote by 5 million votes, Mitt Romney would have won the election. And in 2016, we all pretty much know what happened. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but Donald Trump won the Electoral College, 304 to 227. He was the first president since Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876 to become president after losing the popular vote by a margin of more than 2%. And was, if you count 1824, he was only the 3rd person to pull off that feat, right? So we've seen with these elections that many of the outcomes would remain the same, but quite a few could also be different if we use congressional district method, if it's a direct popular vote, if we stick with the Electoral College. But whatever we do for changes, we need to keep in mind that states control elections. And whatever changes we make, we need to consider how those states will respond as far as who can vote, how can they vote, and if popular votes the way we want to go, is 40% enough? Is 30? Is 20% of the popular vote if we have enough candidates in the race? And should electors be able to switch up who they're going to vote for with no greater penalty than $1,000? There's just a lot of questions to consider. It's a pretty complicated system. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Neil, we do have one question in our chat box, and that is, how are the electorate voters chosen?
So the electors are basically chosen by the parties they are going to be pledged to. So in Maine, for instance, right now, you're going to have the Democratic Party is going to basically put forward people who are going to stand in as the electors. And if Biden won all 4 of the electors, they would send 4 of those people out to cast the votes. And same thing for the Republicans. They have 4 people ready to go. And if Trump received all 4 electoral votes, those people would step in. I've heard rumor that some early ballots in American history actually had you vote for the elector, the person, and people would get confused on if this person represented that candidate or this candidate.
Thank you, Neil. I'm going to give everybody just one more moment. If you have any questions, go ahead and you can try raising your hand. You can put it in the chat box or in the, we do have another question in the Q&A section. Did you say that the electors cast their votes in December?
Correct. They cast their votes on the first Wednesday after the second Monday in December. So we tend to say we have election day and we call an election the day of or a couple days later in some cases. But no election has ever officially been decided earlier than that point in time. We are basically just anticipating, expecting that the electors will vote a certain way. But 2016 was the first election since 1872 when a candidate died. It was the first time where more than one elector became faithless and voted for someone else. We had a failed attempt in Maine, but there were votes cast for Colin Powell. There were votes cast for Kasich. Bernie Sanders received a vote in Hawaii. So we anticipate that they're going to act in the way we expect, but they don't necessarily have to. And the penalties, like I said, typically are no more than $1,000 if there's a penalty at all, besides 14 states, including Maine, which just make it impossible to carry out.
Thank you for that, Neil. We'll give one last call for any questions that anybody might have. All right. If you are still typing, okay, I see it says excellent information and well presented, Neil. I would agree. I was impressed by your thorough, just being able to go from map to map and remember all the details and background of that. So I know I picked the right person for this job. And I'm actually going to go ahead and get this video processed and then linked, and I'm going to send it out in the listserv tomorrow, just in case anybody wants a refresher on the Electoral College and the role Maine has played in that throughout the year. So thank you, Neil, for this very timely, very well done presentation.
Yeah, thanks so much, and everyone have a great rest of your day.